Welcome to the Plain Faith Podcast, Episode 17.
My plan was to get out of school, go work for a startup company, make $1 million, like I said, keep flying to build my time and finish my instrument rating and my commercial certificate. Then I'd build some more time and start working toward an airline job. And that was my plan. But God had different plans.
The Plain Faith Podcast is a podcast about missionary aviation and the stories of missionary aviators who have taken seriously Jesus' command to go and make disciples of all nations and are using airplanes to be His witnesses at the ends of the earth. Thank you for joining us for this episode. Your host for today's show will be Jimmy Tidmore, who, in addition to hosting this podcast, is a pastor and a pilot residing with his family in what is known as the Rocket City, Huntsville, Alabama. He is very interested in promoting missionary aviation and helping prospective missionary pilots reach the mission field. And now, with these introductions out of the way, let's get started on another great episode of the Plain Faith Podcast.
Welcome back to the Plain Faith Podcast. It's really good to be back with you today. This is going to be a very unique episode, a good bit different than anything we've ever done before, because in today's show, I'm going to be the guest. Yes, instead of me interviewing someone else, in today's show, you are going to get to hear someone else interviewing me. And in that interview, we'll get into many of the details and the backstory of Plain Faith and how it came into existence. The host for today's show will be Dylan Thornton. Dylan and I have known each other for over a decade, going back to our seminary days at Beeson Divinity School in Birmingham, Alabama. Dylan is the lead pastor of Faith Community Church in Seminole, Florida, and he is also the creator and host of a podcast of his own called the Good Faith Podcast. And I highly recommend you check it out. He has some great guests, and I have really enjoyed listening to it myself. Well, the content of this episode of the Plain Faith Podcast, as you might have guessed, is actually a recent interview Dylan did with me for his podcast. And as it turned out, we talked a whole lot about Plain Faith and our mission. Again, there are many details about how God initially planted the seed for Plain Faith in my mind many years ago, along with many of the details and the backstory to the whole process of getting things going with Plain Faith. My guess is that if you are a regular listener to this podcast, you'll probably enjoy the interview and this opportunity to get to know me a little bit better and to know some of the history of Plain Faith a little bit better. I'm grateful to Dylan for inviting me on his show and for allowing me to share that interview here. If you do like this interview, please make sure to check out his show as well. I am sure you will enjoy it, and we'll provide a link to it in the show notes for this episode. All right, so let's go ahead and get started.
All right. Well, Jimmy, welcome to the podcast, my friend.
Thank you, Dylan. Glad to be here.
So to give our listeners just a little history, Jimmy and I have known each other for a long time, over a decade. We met in grad school at Beeson Divinity School in Birmingham, Alabama. We both completed our MDivs there. And Jimmy, you just completed your doctoral degree there, haven't you?
Not officially, December the 10th, but I'm as good as done, yes.
Okay, all right, good. I want to hear a little more about that here in a minute. But
okay.
I know, thinking back, my 3 years at Beeson were among the most formative years of my life. And Jimmy, I'm sure you would say you have great memories of your Beeson days as well. Looking back now, it's been 10 years or so since we were working on our MDiv together, which that's amazing to think that 10 years went by.
Yeah.
But how did Beeson prepare you for ministry?
Well, first off, it's really hard to believe that it has been that long, but I guess it has. If I remember correctly, you started the spring before me, and we took summer Greek together, if I'm remembering right. And then
I think that's right, summer Greek, yep.
And then the next summer, we took Hebrew together, I believe.
It's just right into the language, just suffering together, man.
But I definitely remember the Hebrew class with you because we had to memorize 3 verses in Hebrew. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And you came up with this brilliant idea to memorize 3 verses from either Psalm 118 or Psalm 136 because they contain that repeating refrain, for his steadfast love endures forever, which in essence meant cutting what you had to memorize in half after you'd memorized that part.
Exactly. We're smarter, not harder. Smarter, not harder.
Yes. So, of course, I was appalled that you would take such a shortcut. And I was so appalled that I chose 3 verses from the other psalm with that same refrain and stole your idea. And seriously, every time I read one of those psalms, I think about you and laugh. I often use them for our call to worship, but I'm trying not to laugh in my head as I'm doing that. But yes, those days at Beeson were full of good times. I have great memories of it all. I'm not sure if you remember, but I was transitioning out of software development into ministry, and was fortunate enough to have an employer in Birmingham who was very good to me during that time. But between school and working, those days were also super long and super tough for both me and my family. But I still have good memories of it all. And while I wouldn't want to do it again, I do miss it. I know that's odd to say, but I think you understand what I mean. So the best memory I guess I have is graduation day. Besides my marriage and the birth of my kids, there have not been many days that were much happier. We'll talk about it later, but getting my pilot's license ranks up there with it too. But like I said, those days were rigorous, and combined with the demanding job during all that, it was tough. So yeah, I was excited on graduation day, even though there was that odd deal where you still had to take your finals after the ceremony.
Exactly. Right.
Just another one of their torture devices for us. But seriously, I loved Beeson very much, and I miss it. Yes, I've been back, but not in the same way. And of course, the best memories I have are of the people like you and the other students and professors. It was a great place. And,
it was a really strong learning community, wasn't it? It
absolutely was. And, while it is hard to be completely prepared for ministry, I don't think you can be completely prepared. I also don't think I could have gone anywhere else that would have prepared me better, particularly in the realm of preaching.
Yeah, agreed.
From day one, with that summer Greek class, everything we did was preparing us to preach and teach God's word, which, in my opinion, as a pastor, is the primary task of a pastor.
Yeah.
That is how we feed the sheep. We feed them with God's word. And Beeson definitely prepared me to do that. In fact, as a reminder to myself of what those folks at Beeson expect from me, every Sunday when I walk into the pulpit, I'm walking into the pulpit with that Bible they gave us at the commencement ceremony.
One of those pew Bibles that we had in the chapel. Yeah,
that's right. And it's a reminder to me of what I have walked into the pulpit to do that morning and what the people at Beeson expect me to do. And that is to open up God's word for God's people as I'm enabled by God's Spirit. So yes, I am very thankful for my time at Beeson. And, as you said, I loved it so much that I went back for more, and will be graduating in December with my doctorate of ministry.
So tell me a little about that. What was the focus of your DMin work?
Yeah, so the focus that I ended up settling on was the role of preaching in church revitalization. The idea was kind of like preaching and discipleship juxtaposed against pragmatic sorts of approaches, 10 steps to a healthier church type thing. So what role does preaching and disciple making and discipleship have to play in church revitalization? So that was the topic of my dissertation.
And did you have a specific supervisor or someone you worked closely with?
Yes. So Mark Devine was my advisor through the whole process. And, he has a lot of experience in that world. And so it was a really good matchup for us to work together on this. And he was also my mentor professor the whole way through. And actually, I'll probably get into it some more, but he's really the reason why I got into church revitalization in the first place.
So for all of our listeners out there, anybody who's thinking about working on a master's degree or even a doctorate at DMin, Beeson is a great place. I know Jimmy and I would both highly recommend it. Beeson Divinity School in Birmingham, Alabama. Go check it out, and you won't be disappointed.
Yep.
Well, one of the things that I think I love the most about Beeson is that, like you've already said, it was and still is a very intellectually and theologically rigorous place, and yet it's also missionally zealous, which is a pretty rare combination, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the requirements that where it was in place at Beeson when we were there, I assume it still is, was a cross-cultural ministry practicum. So in essence, all students were required to go on a mission trip, to travel outside the U.S., to experience Christian ministry in another part of the world. Jimmy and I, along with many other Beeson students, went to London. We learned from and worked with London City Mission and a number of other groups while there. Jimmy, I'm sure you remember that trip. What do you remember most about that cross-cultural ministry practicum? And kind of looking back on that now, how do you see God preparing you through that experience for what you're doing today?
Yeah, that was a great memory of my time at Beeson, and it was awesome that you and I got to room together. But before that trip, to be honest, I really remember feeling and thinking when I first heard about the location for the trip that London wouldn't necessarily be all that cross-cultural for us, and that it would kind of be cheating in some way, or maybe even cheating us in some way. But as it turned out, I was dead wrong. While I guess New York City is probably close to it, I'm guessing that London has to be the most culturally diverse place on earth. In fact, there are even parts of London that I don't think look at all like what someone would think of London. I remember one area we visited, I think it was Southall, but don't hold me to that, where there were streets that if you were just magically placed there, just appeared out of nowhere, and someone asked you where on the earth you were, you honestly would have had a difficult time believing that you were not somewhere in South Asia. And I've been to India 3 or 4 times, and it looked so much like that. It was amazing. And so my thoughts about London not being a real cross-cultural experience were totally unfounded and actually pretty ignorant, but I just didn't know what I didn't know.
Yeah.
But getting to your question, I guess the main thing I took away from that trip that was very formative to me has to do with the importance of contextualization. And by that, I mean that, yes, we have a set in stone gospel message, a message that doesn't change, is good news for everyone, no matter where they're from, no matter what time in history they have lived. But that message, if it is going to be shared effectively, will need to be culturally contextualized so that it hits the mark in the particular place and with the particular people with whom you are sharing. And this is true and must be understood not only by people who are sharing the gospel on the other side of the world, but also by people sharing the gospel on the other side of town or even on the other side of the street. Tim Keller talks a lot about this and probably understands it better than most of us do. But for example, when I moved from Birmingham, Alabama to an eclectic little community in Huntsville, Alabama, 2 cities less than 2 hours apart from one another, I knew the importance of studying the place and really getting to know the people and the context which I had been placed by God as a minister of the gospel. There are people who've lived in our little community up here for like 50 years. And I know people who've lived here over 30 years who are still considered outsiders.
Wow.
And so just like a missionary who travels to some other part of the world where it's obvious that the gospel is going to need to be contextualized, it's true to some degree for all of us as pastors, even if we're just sharing down the road from where we grew up. No place is the same. No church is the same. No community is the same. And in fact, I think that's what got so many people confused and frustrated in the whole church growth movement a few decades ago. They thought that they could read a book and do exactly what that author did in their church, and poof, they'd have the same results. Well, that's not how it works. First, and obviously, God has to be involved. But second, contextualization is so important. And I came to see that clearly in London, where ministry was being done in one way on one street, and then just a few blocks away, you had an entirely different context, which necessitated an entirely different approach to ministry, which is why it's important that we as pastors not only know how to study God's word, but also know how to study the people in our particular ministry context if we're going to effectively communicate the gospel to them. Now, I'm not saying that I have all this down or anything like that, but I have come to see the importance of contextualization, and that cross-cultural ministry practicum in London was probably the beginning of that realization for me.
That's really, really well said, Jimmy. I like what you said a lot. There's a saying in certain educational fields, a very basic say, if you're going to teach math to Johnny, you have to know math and Johnny. And I think that applies exactly to what you're saying here. We have to know the gospel, obviously. We have to be students of God's word. We have to also be students of our culture, of our community in which God has sovereignly stationed us to share that gospel. So that makes perfect sense. One of the things that I remember most about the London trip, I'm curious if you remember this. We were in a church. I'm sure it was an Anglican church. I don't remember the name of the church, but I remember how they used their facility. They had a very historic building, sanctuary, wooden floors, I think, pews. but they had put their pews on wheels so they could wheel them to the side. And during the week, they would have basketball hoops and toys. And you remember that? That they would bring the kids in that community as an outreach. And I thought, wow, what a wonderful use of this very traditional space, because they didn't have a lot of space, but it was a multi-purpose space. And I loved that.
Yeah, I do remember that facility, and you're right. It was like a very traditional space. In fact, if I remember correctly, that was the church that had that really, really old organ. I don't remember like if it was the oldest, still in operation organ or something. I remember there was like a sign around it or something like that. Yeah. So I do remember that place. That was really cool.
So let's kind of segue now. What you've said about contextualization definitely applies, here in the States as well, in our local communities. You're a local church pastor. Tell us a little bit about the community you're in, the church where you serve currently.
Yeah, so I'm a pastor, so I talk a lot. So let me do some background. So I already said that I believe I already mentioned that I was in software development, and I was transitioning to, before I was a pastor. I finished Auburn University in 1998 with a management information systems degree and started working in web and software development right after graduation, which was a really good field to be in the late 1990s with the whole .com boom thing going on.
Yeah.
I fully expected to become a millionaire like it seemed every other 20-something-year-old in the world was doing at that time, but that didn't quite happen. But I really did enjoy working in that field. However, in about 2007, God began working on me about vocational ministry. I won't go into all the details about that process because it's a long story, but eventually my wife, Laura, and I came to realize that God was indeed calling me into vocational ministry. And I emphasize vocational ministry intentionally because I think we're all called to be in ministry. But God was calling me to be in vocational ministry. And once I became settled in that, I knew that seminary would be next. And again, I won't go into all the details surrounding how I settled on Beeson, but it became clear for me for a lot of reasons that Beeson was the place for us. Part of that was that Beeson was on one end of Lakeshore Drive in Birmingham, and the place I was working in software development was on the other side, and like 7 or 8 minutes apart. So even for very practical reasons, Beeson made a lot of sense. I knew I could keep supporting and providing for my family much easier if I stayed put with the company I was at versus packing up and moving to another state, et cetera. But anyway, when I started seminary, and I promise I'm getting to your question, all I knew is that God was calling me into local church ministry. I wasn't sure what that meant, just on a staff at a church, serving God and his people at that church in some way. But then after, I guess, a year or so at Beeson, it became very clear to me that I wanted and felt that God wanted me to preach, to be in the role of a preaching pastor at a church. So I began to focus in on that area and prepare mentally and academically for that sort of ministry. But still, while that narrows things down some, there were a lot of questions. Would I get on staff at a larger church where I could be mentored for a while by an experienced pastor? Would I go plant a church? That was a cool and sexy thing to do. Can I say sexy on the podcast?
Sure you can. Why
not? But you know what I mean when I say that. It was kind of a cool, hip thing to do. A lot of people planting churches. Or would I find some church, a smaller church most likely, who would be dumb enough to take someone like me with no experience whatsoever to serve as their pastor? So again, I'd already mentioned that we had mentor professors at Beeson, and in God's providence, he placed me from day one with Dr. Mark Devine. And I say in God's providence because that actually turned out to be significant in my ministry today. You see, Dr. Devine, as I said earlier, has had a lot of experience in the intentional interim world, which for those who don't know, that means that he goes into struggling churches who are in between pastors and serves as an interim pastor for them and helps prepare them for their next pastor. A lot of times an intentional interim is called in when a church is churning through pastor after pastor, and it becomes obvious that that church has some issues that need to be addressed before they chew up and spit out another pastor.
Right.
Well, in addition to that, and probably actually in conjunction with that is a better way to say it, in conjunction with that, Dr. Devine has a lot of experience with churches who have declined and dwindled and are in need of what we call church revitalization. And it was through my time with Dr. Devine, and actually as a result of a one-on-one conversation he had with me one day after our mentoring group, that I came to the point where I was feeling led into the church revitalization world myself. And so that is where I began directing my attention in the church search as I was approaching the end of my time at Beeson. And it also turned out that I was good friends with the individual at Beeson who helped place students with churches upon graduation. In fact, we went to church together, and I had taught her sons in Sunday school and so forth. And obviously she knew the type of church I was looking for. And one day I'm sitting in class and she emails me saying, something like, "Hey, I think you're in class, so I probably shouldn't be emailing you, but I have this individual on the phone from a church in Huntsville that sounds exactly like what you're looking for. Their pastor's about to retire, and he is calling about students to come fill the pulpit while they're looking for their next pastor. But again, it sounds like what you're looking for, and it may lead to something else if you go up there and preach for them." And I agreed with her, and I may have even bribed her not to tell anyone else at Beeson about the position. And I got the opportunity to go preach for them one Sunday, and that led to some conversations and a couple of invites back. And eventually they offered me the position, and I accepted starting just a short while after graduation, in fact. So it worked out perfectly. I finished Beeson in December of 2012 and started at Monte Santo Baptist Church in February of 2013. And so that will be 9 years in just a few months. And it has indeed been a revitalization process. When we arrived at the church in 2009, there were about 30 people in attendance each Sunday. And among those was a single young family with 3 kids.
Oh, wow.
Most everyone else was over 70 with a lot over 80.
Mm-hmm.
So we knew that it was important to get some young families involved in the work we were doing there. And God was actually so very good to us in that regard. And today, while we're still a small church, I'm trying to stop saying that. I'm trying to stop calling it a small church and trying to start calling it a normal church.
Yeah.
Because most people worship in churches every Sunday that have fewer than 100 people.
Oh, yeah, that's exactly right.
So it's a normal church. But now we regularly have 60 to 70 people in the service. Right before COVID, we were averaging 71. And while I know it isn't overly spiritual to talk about numbers when you talk about a church, like how many people you have in attendance and so forth, the fact is that numbers really do matter for those in the church revitalization world, because a church is always dead when there aren't enough people attending any longer to keep the doors open.
Yeah.
So while I do think that people can be too focused on numbers when they talk about church, when you go into a church that's been dwindling for years and years, the most urgent need you have is to stop that, or else the church is going to close the doors and the surrounding community is going to lose a gospel presence there.
Right. That's really well said. That's really well said.
So, I know we like to get all spiritual and say, well, we shouldn't really talk about numbers. Well, if the church is going to close, the numbers actually do matter. But anyway, so while I guess I'd say that while we still have work to do, the church is now in a healthy place. It's a healthy congregation that is in no longer any immediate danger of closing its doors or anything like that. I would say we still need to get more serious in terms of our disciple-making mission in our community. But that's on me. And it's in my crosshairs right now. We have added a lot of folks. We've gotten things shored up. We've done some renovations to the building, and now we are in a position where we really have to start getting more serious about making disciples who make disciples. And when you think about it, in fact, that is the biblical formula for church revitalization anyway, isn't it? Listen to Jesus when he says, "Go and make disciples." That is a surefire way to revitalize a congregation. So, but honestly, I couldn't have asked for a better church. They have been very kind to me. They have allowed me to lead. Unlike other pastors who have all these horror stories, I really don't. We are very happy to be here. We're grateful for what God has done while we've been here, and look forward to many more years of ministry in this same place with these same people. There's nothing spectacular going on. No one's going to ever write a book about what's going on at our church. I'm just trying to faithfully teach God's word to God's people so that they know him better, love him more, and become more and more conformed into the likeness of his son.
Praise God for that, man. Praise God. Looking back over the last 9-ish years, what would you say is the single most challenging thing you faced as you have attempted to revitalize the church? So, I work a lot with church planters, and sometimes people ask me, what is the more difficult task, planting a church or revitalizing a dying church? I think they're just different, but they're both really, really, really hard. What has been one of the challenges, or maybe the top challenge you faced as you have successfully now, I think, by God's grace, revitalized this church?
Yeah, I agree. I think they're both difficult for different reasons. Church revitalization, they usually have some tangible things. They have a building, they have some property, they have those sorts of things, where church planting does not have those things. But then, I often thought when we were starting, I don't know, some way into it a couple of years, I thought, planting a church up here might have been easier, right? But I think the most difficult thing that I encountered early on was at some point, we start adding new folks, and you've got most of the folks who remained at our church. A lot of them were founding charter members of the congregation. Others had been there for decades. And so then you start adding these new people, and it was very difficult. I was going to say not to feel like it was very difficult for it almost not to be like two separate congregations.
Yeah.
And that was a real struggle and a real challenge for a while. It's like I had these two different groups of people. I had the older, and I don't necessarily mean demographically older. I mean, they had been there the longest amount of time. And then we had the newer crowd who had come as a result of some of the things that we were doing and so forth, and had come since that we had started the ministry work there. And it wasn't that anybody who had been at the church was intentionally keeping an arm's length distance or anything like that. It was just, felt like for a long time that we had these two different congregations, and bringing those two groups together to where they were truly one congregation was probably the biggest challenge that I faced. It never got ugly or anything like that. It was just something that I, and maybe only I, as the pastor, noticed and felt, and felt like I needed to work through to bring people together so that, it's not, this is, there's two different groups of people here, the old group and the new group, but that we're one group. We're, the saints at Monte Santo Baptist Church in Huntsville, Alabama.
Right. So, I think COVID, of course, has been challenging for all of us. I always like to ask this question when I have another pastor on the show, just because I'm curious to see how other churches have endured. What is the mix of your congregation now in person compared to what it was pre-pandemic?
Yeah, so we're not down that much in as far as the main people who were attending. We still have some folks who seem staying away for health reasons, and I understand that, but for the most part, we're back to normal in terms of the services we're doing and the activities we're doing and the people who are attending. Most churches have people who are attending who are kind of on the fringe of things. That they're not necessarily regular. They're there every now and then. And I have noticed, and those are the people that I'm honestly, most concerned about with all this, that a lot of those folks have just drifted away. Are they just not attending at all? Or are they attending another church? And it's hard to know some of that. And so you do worry about that. But thankfully, and it seems like most of the pastors I've talked to, we've come through the COVID thing fine, unscathed, no permanent damage. We're still not maybe exactly back to where we were, but honestly, Dylan, there was a time when I was we had worked really hard. Yes, God does the work, but we work hard too. Paul says something about that. And in a selfish crybaby moment in the middle of COVID, I was pitching a temper tantrum, thinking, God, if I've done all this work and we go back to square one, I'm not sure that I can handle that. And God was good, did not allow that to happen, reminded me, to stop being a baby and to trust him. And so we have come through as good as we have. And we actually, oddly enough, have added some people through. Some very good folks have been added through all this as well. So I'm so ready for all of this COVID stuff to be completely behind us, if it ever will be. But overall, our congregation has not suffered in any permanent or lasting way.
That's good news, man. That's good to hear. So you're obviously making a difference in your local community, Jimmy. I'm thankful for that and for all the things that your church is doing. One of the things we typically do on this podcast is emphasize that very fact, making a difference in the local community. But today I kind of want to widen our focus a bit to the global project that you are a part of, in addition to your full-time, vocational pastoral responsibilities. Tell us about the Plain Faith Project.
Okay, well, once again, it's really hard for me to talk about Plain Faith without going way back, like almost 30 years back, because that is, in a sense, where this whole idea began. It's really cool to think about the way God is guiding and directing your life in very specific ways without you even knowing it a lot of time. Because as I was graduating high school and trying to figure out what I wanted to do in college, I decided that I wanted to be an airline pilot. I actually first had some interest in going the Air Force route, but eventually decided against that and decided that I would just become an airline pilot instead. Well, it turned out that Auburn University had a very good aviation program. They still do. In fact, I think it's the oldest continuously operated flight school in the world or something like that. But
Ripley, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird little fact. But anyway, I headed down to Auburn wanting to be an airline pilot. I was also going because that is where my girlfriend was going. And that did work out because we've been married for 22 years now. But I was also going to Auburn to be an airline pilot. Well, I got down to Auburn and started off in their aviation program. But not too long into my time there, you get down there, you start making some new friends. And I met this guy whose dad was an airline pilot. And this guy's dad ended up telling me that maybe I should think about majoring in something else besides aviation. His reasoning was that in case I lost my medical down the road at some point, or that my future wife got fed up with the airline pilot life or whatever. I didn't have anyone in my family who was a pilot and really didn't know anything about it. Just made sense to me that, hey, if you wanted to be an airline pilot and colleges offered this aviation degree, that's what you needed to go get a degree in. But as it turns out, you really just needed, and still is true, you need a 4-year degree. So it doesn't matter what it's in necessarily. So this friend's dad advised me to get a degree in something I enjoyed doing, something, I guess, to fall back on, so to speak, while pursuing my pilot certificates and ratings outside of Auburn's aviation program. And in fact, that's what my friend, this guy's son, who advised me, is doing now. It worked out for him because he's actually a FedEx pilot today. But so I changed my major, and again, all of this is long before any call to ministry. Okay, I mean, I'm not thinking down. I mean, I was a believer and so forth, but I wasn't thinking call to ministry. So I changed my major to management information systems because I like computers. I did start flying as well, though, like he advised, and I got my private pilot certificate while at Auburn. Began working on my instrument rating. Unfortunately, my instructor finished Auburn before I got done, so I didn't get the instrument rating done there. But I was management information systems major, but I was still focused on an airline pilot career. Well, as I said earlier, when I finished Auburn in 1998, we were in the middle of the dot-com boom in this country, and my plan was to get out of school, go work for a startup company, make $1 million, like I said, keep flying to build my time and finish my instrument rating and my commercial certificate. Then I'd build some more time and start working toward an airline job. And that was my plan. But God had different plans. Obviously, I'm in a completely different place than that now. And I can also, again, really see his hand guiding me through all of this now. It wasn't always clear to me then, but I can see it now. So to cut the story short, getting married, working a job, and doing all that grown-up stuff really cut into the plans I had for continuing flight training after college. And then September 11th happened, which really changed the whole airline industry in a lot of different ways. And I kind of also decided somewhere along the way that I probably wouldn't like being away from home as much as I thought I might when I was younger. And honestly, I was kind of liking what I was doing in the computer world. Remember, again, this is before call to ministry. Now, all that said, I did go on to get my instrument rating, my multi-engine rating, and my commercial pilot certificate. So I could have continued down that path had I chosen to. I just didn't want to do it anymore, which is kind of interesting because, I don't know, I found that so very often the way God gets us to do what he wants us to do is by changing our hearts. Imagine that. The God who takes our heart of stone and replaces it with a heart of flesh to accomplish his ultimate purposes for us. Imagine that this same God would continue working on our hearts and doing that sort of things in our lives, molding and shaping our hearts and our desires to get us to do the type of thing that he wants us to do. That's exactly how he called me into ministry, in fact. But again, that's no different than how he calls us to be a believer in the first place. I mean, he changes our heart. Well, once I decided I wasn't going to pursue the airline thing, I still thought, I think I'm still going to become a flight instructor. I'd enjoy that. A lot of folks use flight instructing to build time for the airlines. There's this time you have to cross where you're qualified for the airline. But anyway, I wasn't going to the airline anymore, but I thought flight instructing would still be something I'd enjoy. Well, as it turns out, I never became a flight instructor, although I still am hoping to one day. But about the same time that I was working on that flight instructor idea in my head, and now I'm getting around to the whole plain faith story, I found out something about missionary pilots and their training that kind of bothered me. Obviously, as a pilot who's a believer, missionary pilots and missionary aviation was always something I was interested in, but I found out that many prospective missionary pilots were going deep into debt, sometimes six figures into debt, to get the training they needed to be qualified to serve with one of the mission aviation organizations. And that just really bothered me. Honestly, I thought it was crazy. Not crazy that they do it, not crazy that they'd go into the debt, crazy that they'd have to do it. In my mind, if the church was the one sending them, it made no sense for them to personally take on that much debt just so that they could be sent. And so way back then, and this was probably in about 2004 or 2005, again, before call to ministry, I thought, well, if I ever become a flight instructor, I'll offer my services for free to anyone who wants to be missionary pilot. And I may even help subsidize the aircraft rental cost and so forth. And so that whole seed in my life was planted then and there. That concern about what I refer to as the debt problem in missionary aviation, kind of resonated with me, stuck in my back of my mind. The simple fact is flight training, it just is expensive. It is. And I know there are some people who say, well, you just shouldn't ever go into debt ever. And I understand, and I tend to agree with that for most things. But in my mind, this really isn't much different than someone who feels called to be a medical missionary.
Yeah, right.
We all know that medical school is super expensive too. How long would it take for someone who's just a regular person without a rich family or a ton of money? How long would it take them to save up enough money to pay for medical school? It would take them forever. And we need doctors on the mission field now. And so what is the fastest way to get them there? Well, sometimes that means student loans and so forth. Well, again, it's no different with missionary pilots. For some of them, it's the best option they have for getting to the mission field in a reasonable amount of time, which is still like 10 years from the day they decide they want to start training for it. It's a long process. So this seed was planted in my head, but then I have a kid, start wrestling with a call to ministry, eventually start seminary. And honestly, I pretty much decided that I may not ever fly again, just for financial reasons and other reasons. And I didn't for a long time. I didn't have the time, didn't have the brain power or the money. None of that was there in seminary. And so in some way, I think God was wanting me to be willing to lay that whole flying thing down too. I had laid a lot down when I decided to follow his call to ministry. I had a good job at a great company with a good future there. We had a nice house and all the stuff people in America dream of. And we were turning our back on that to follow God. And I think laying down the flying stuff was really the last part of it for me. And honestly, it was very hard. I'm kind of embarrassed to say it because I don't know, it shows how much maybe it was a little idle to me, but there were tears when I remember I sold my stuff. It was hard.
Yeah.
Well, fast forward through seminary and my first couple of years of serving as a pastor, the opportunity to start flying again came my way. And I won't go into that story because I'm talking way too much now. But God was at work in that too. He really opened the door for me and made it possible again when I didn't think it would be. He did that in a couple of different ways. But as soon as I started flying again, this whole idea, something I had not thought about for probably 10 years, came right back to me. And honestly, it came back even more strongly, this whole problem with the debt thing in missionary aviation. So I began to do some checking around to see if the situation was the same, to see if pilots were still going deep into debt to become missionary pilots. And I quickly found out that it was still happening. Now that I was a pastor, I had some street cred or these missions organizations, and I was able to have some good conversation with folks within them. And from what I found out, the debt problem was still there. And understand, it's not just that I don't think it's right for these people to have to go into personal debt to fund their training. It's also that the debt ends up being a hurdle for them to get a position with the mission organizations in the first place. These organizations who are struggling to have enough pilots, because each of these organizations wisely say, this is wise, they wisely say, just like all missions organizations, hey, we can't send you to the mission field until you have your debt down to this certain level.
Yeah.
And I understand that and agree with it. But then what happens is you have someone who's trained to be a missionary pilot. The mission organization wants them. They tell them they have to begin paying down their debt. They work to pay down their debt, but then they get married. Then they have some kids. The debt payoff process grinds to a halt, and it eventually becomes obvious they are never going to get it paid down, and they're going to get a job doing something else, maybe a job with an airline or something like that. And they never end up going to the mission field. Or maybe they do end up getting the debt paid down to whatever level that the mission agency requires, not completely paid off, but paid down so that they can be deployed. But then what often ends up happening is that with this debt hanging over their heads, it ends up being a stressor for them that brings them home from the mission field prematurely. Just like the rest of us, they have kids needing to go to college. They have weddings to pay for. They have all the stuff that we have that's looming out there in the future. And the debt is a stressor for them, and they come home early as a result. I've talked to people who have shared these types of stories many times. So what we are doing at Plain Faith is trying to help missionary pilots with their flight training debt by awarding something we're calling takeoff grants. The way these grants work is that they will pay the monthly flight training debt payments for missionary pilots as long as they are on the mission field. The idea is to make it so that it is like their debt is not even there. We make their payments for them each month as long as they're on the mission field. And again, the idea is to get them to the mission field faster and to keep them there longer. And that is our main mission at Plain Faith. We do also have a podcast that is designed to promote missionary aviation to people who may not know that much about it. It's also ended up being something that God has used to call people into missionary aviation, which has been really cool to hear from young people that say, hey, because of your podcast, I'm feeling called to mission aviation and I'm going to pursue it. That's really cool. And we're also planning to start hosting some events at local airports called Hangar Church. The idea behind these is like a Saturday event at airports where we would hold a service and probably serve some breakfast or lunch in a hangar with the idea of making and maturing disciples within the aviation community, while also promoting missionary aviation and raising funds for our takeoff grant program. And we're hoping to get those started next year. But again, at the end of the day, Plain Faith exists because of this debt problem in missionary aviation. That will always be our main mission. This has been our first year in operation, actually not even a full year. And we decided to limit ourselves to a single grant to get things going. We have awarded it to a guy who's headed to Papua New Guinea in March of next year, and he will be flying float planes down a river in Papua New Guinea doing medical evacuations and stuff like that. But also he'll be, of course, sharing the gospel and caring for the spiritual needs of the people there. But we're excited about that. Next year, we're planning to award and fund 3 more grants, and again, to get our Hangar Church stuff going. It's all been a lot of fun, but it's also been a lot of work, more than I expected. But it's so exciting to me. It's right up my alley. Again, to see the path that God has taken me on and the way that he has prepared me for this very specific kind of niche ministry has been pretty cool. To be honest, I'm not very good at any one thing, but the way he's designed my life, given me the opportunity to pick up some very specific yet unrelated skills, from the flying skills to the technology skills to the ministry training, and that he's taken all that and stirred it together in just the right way and then led me to this opportunity to serve them in this kind of very niche way has been pretty cool to watch. So I'm very grateful.
My guess, Jimmy, is that many of our listeners have maybe never thought about missionary aviation. and probably have never thought about this debt problem. Didn't even realize it was a thing. So I imagine this is very new for a lot of people, eye-opening. Maybe some people out there are moved by this, want to get more involved. As you come to the end of the calendar year, you're looking into Plain Faith Ministries for next year. What are some of your greatest needs in this moment?
Yeah. So right now we're working to finish funding, finish our fundraising for this year. We're getting very close, but we still have a little bit to go on that first takeoff grant we have awarded and fully funded. Again, they are headed to Papua New Guinea in March of next year, and we're hoping to have that grant fully funded by the end of this year because we really want to shift gears. We're already looking forward to next year. Like I said, we're wanting to do 3 grants next year and get the Hangar Church events up and going. So we're definitely looking for people to partner with us in this, both individuals and churches. Listen to the podcast, share it with people that you know. I think it is a way to educate people about missionary aviation, help them understand just how much mission work around the world depends on these airplanes and the pilots and so forth. And, our website kind of shares more about what we're doing. And I'd love for anyone to visit, and get that information from us there.
Well, Jimmy, I have just the greatest admiration for you, my friend, and such a deep appreciation for your kingdom mindset. I will remember to pray for missionary aviation for the pilots who are carrying the gospel to the ends of the earth. And I just want to say thank you for your leadership, brother, and thank you for your time today and joining us on the podcast.
Man, it has been great. I'm sorry I talked so much, but I'm just so excited about.
Man, you got a great story to tell. I'm glad you talked.
Thank you, and it's so good to hear your voice and to reconnect with you today.
Thanks, my buddy.
Take care.
Well, that's it for this episode. We thank you once again for listening. You can learn more about the podcast and subscribe to it by visiting plainfaith.com. That's PLANE faith.com. You will also find links there to connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And of course, Jimmy would love to hear from you personally. So feel free to email him at jimmy@plainfaith.com or by using the contact form on our website. Until next time, remember that God made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God.
The intro and outro music for the Plain Faith podcast is a song called Chipper by Kevin MacLeod. You can find his work at incompetech.com.